Hello, my dear students. Welcome to the third class of the model Developmental Psychology 2. Today we will continue to talk about adolescence. And the dimension of adolescence that we'll talk about today is about intellectual and cognitive development. This is the summary of the session. First, we will see some biological changes related to cognitive development. Then we'll see how cognition will evolve during adolescence and different factors or aspects of adolescence. And finally, what are the factors that moderate the expression of cognitive skills in adolescence. When we talk about intellectual and cognitive development, we cannot ignore that there is a biological dimension. Indeed, it is in our brain that we have our cognition. Indeed, the biological changes in puberty are not only related with the secondary sexual characteristics, but also with some aspects in the brain and function of our cognition. Uh, Indeed, we have the brain structure or functions that will be changed, and we'll see it in a while. And we also have many differences related to the hormones, what we call the endocrine and neuroendocrine changes, that also affect many different functions, including emotions and motivation. This is also a period in which there is a huge development of spatial ability, namely what is related to gender differences, related to hemispheric laterality, as we'll see in a while too. The brain lateralization, you have it, let me see, you have it here, brain lateralization is one important aspect of the difference between men and women. Indeed, what happens in our brains is that the brain of the man is more lateralized than the brain of women. What happens is that in a typical male brain, most of the connections, this blue that you have, happen more in the same size of the brain, like this. But in a typical female brain, most of the connections between the neurons happen between both hemispheres. More connections between both hemispheres of the brain. So that's why we can say that men's brain are more lateralized. This structural difference of the brain between men and women that becomes more uh, important in adolescence uh, is related to differences in uh, visual abilities. Indeed, that's also why men usually have better skills to find themselves in the space, to organize themselves in the field, and this is also related to testosterone, one hormone that is also related to aggression. This is a very interesting aspect that is related with phylogenetic development, with the history of mankind. As you know, when many years ago, when we were living in the jungle, it was the men, because the men that had the role of going out to hunt and to find food for the families. So the men started to develop more testosterone, this hormone, more testosterone, which is real associated to aggression, because they need to have courage to face the danger of the animals. And the brain starts to be more lateralized because they have to walk a lot, they have to go outside in the space, and they have to find points of reference to know where to go and from where to go and how to go back to their village. So indeed, there are significant differences in the brain of men and women, and these differences start to be more clear during adolescence. Another very important aspect uh, related to the brain and how it affects cognition and also emotion and action during adolescence is the development of the prefrontal cortex. This area of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, uh, as I think that you already learned in the model with Professor Raquel, is very. The prefrontal cortex plays a very important role in humans functioning because it is responsible for the executive functions. These executive functions include aspects related to decision making, to integrate information from all the other areas of the brain and to make decisions. And this includes to regulate emotions, and this includes to include moral values and principles in our action. The example of Phineas Cage, this gentleman who had an accident and in which a tube cut the connection of the prefrontal cortex with the rest of the brain, is a very interesting example of the importance of the prefrontal cortex in our behavior. Because when this man lost the connection of the prefrontal cortex with the rest of the brain, he continued to function, to live, but he lost what we can say his identity, his personality, his ability to make actions. And what happens is that during adolescence, the process of myelination, I think I told you about this last year. Myelination is a process in which the neurons in this part start to be covered by a substance that will increase the efficiency of the flow of conductivity of the uh, electricity in the brain. So, with this process of myelination, uh, the functioning of the brain will start to be more efficient and more appropriate. And this continues to develop through adolescence. And what happens is that the prefrontal cortex is the last one to mature. Indeed, uh, the areas related to information from the senses and movement control, all these areas of the brain related to process information that arrives, named this area, the occipital, and the area here that processes the movement control, all these areas are the first to be mature, to have this process of myelination complete. So we have a human being, an adolescent, completely ready to act, to move, to do things, and with the good skills to process all the information that comes from the senses. However, the last part to mature is exactly the prefrontal cortex. And this prefrontal cortex is also responsible for the control of impulses and for planning behavior. So, what happens is that is exactly because of this that we can say that sometimes adolescents are more impulsive, they have more difficulty in regulating emotions, or they are very emotional. Because indeed, this area of the brain is the last one to mature. This is also a moment in which our brain, adolescence is a moment in which our brain starts to have significant differences in the amount of gray and white matter. What is happening is that we can call this is a second wave of overproduction of synapses. You remember when I told you last year the first years of life are moments until middle childhood are moments in which children have lots of connections in the brain, and after that it will start a process of pruning or selection of the best or the most important connections. What happens in adolescence is that there are overproduction of synapses, and the process selection will start after that. Indeed, adolescence is a period in which there is an intense brain activities. So, three remarks that I want you to keep related to development of the brain. First one, this is a substantial development. There is a substantial development in the adolescence in the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is the last one to be developed and is in a continuous process of use change during this period. Second, in adolescence, there is a huge connectivity in the brain with increased myelination. Uh, in fact, there are lots of activity of brain activity. Finally, with the process of synaptic pruning, selecting the more efficient connections, there is a decrease in the gray matter. So these three important ideas are important for you to keep, because these are really aspects will be affecting the cognitive and also later the emotional development in adolescence. And the idea is the same that we already talked last year. They are changes in the brain that are related to maturation, but also that are shaped and scoped by experience through the process of development. So, how it is the evolution of cognition do? And when we talk about cognition, there are three kinds of mental entities, or three dimensions that we should pay attention. The knowledge, cognitive processes and capacities, and metacognitive orientations. This aspect of metacognitive orientation is very important, and we'll talk also about this later. When we talk about knowledge, we can distinguish three types of knowledge. First, declarative knowledge, that is related with knowing that. Is the information that we know, going to school, reading, having access to the information on the news or on the internet. Then there is the procedural knowledge, that is knowing how to do things, how to drive, how to cook, is related more with processes of doing things. And conceptual knowledge, that is knowing why, the type of knowledge with the explanation to why things happen. These three types of knowledge have different evolution during adolescence. The studies are showing that uh, all of them, declarative, procedural, and conceptual development, increase with age. So the increasing process in knowledge is continuous. However, there is the idea that comparing to the increase of development of knowledge in the first 4 years, the amount of knowledge that we acquire from the fourth grade to until the university, of course, we acquire a lot, but the amount, the speed of increasing the knowledge is much slower than what was. We already talked a little bit about knowledge. Now let's talk about cognitive process and capacities. At this level, we need to distinguish forms of reasoning, encoding, learning, and retrieval. Well, retrieval is easy, is how to get the information that we stored in our memory. The learning is exactly how to store and the information in our long-term memory system. The encoding is how we organize and the information in our mind in a way to make a mental representation that can be stored. And finally, the form of reasoning includes the mental processes that we use to analyze the information that we receive, to make decisions, and to solve problems. And based on this concept of form of reasoning, uh, I would like you to do the first exercise. So I want you to think, what would the world be like if people have tails? Can you see here people with tails? So I just want you to answer this question. Go to the Google Classroom file that I create and answer this question. If people would have tails, how the world would be? But after that, I also want you to think a little bit. What do you need to be able to do in order to answer that question? You will answer this question, but after that, I want you to think about your own thinking. What you have to do in order to do this. And I also would like you to think a little bit about what you think are the differences between your answer and the answer that younger kids would do. We will talk about that. One of the most important characteristics of the form of reasoning in this period is the ability to combine premises and derive a logically sound conclusion from these premises. This is exactly thinking logically. And these examples are showing this. For instance, if today is Monday, and Monday I have a class, so if today is Monday, I can conclude that today I have a class. So this uh, way of thinking logically is one of the main characteristics of the thinking of adolescents. And as you know, one of the persons who studied the forms of reasoning in cognitive development was a gentleman named Jean Piaget. And Jean Piaget identified that when we arrived to adolescence, uh, we are moving to from a concrete form of reasoning to a form of formal operations. So let's make a bit summary of Piaget. Piaget told about constructivism, showing that children create knowledge, acting and interacting with the environment, and identify different stages of cognitive development: sensory-motor, pre-operational, concrete operations, and now, where we are here, in the formal operations. So, in the previous stage or period of cognitive development, children was able to do concrete operations. I think that you remember that we did this exercise with water to talk about the conservation as one of the mental operations that children was able to do. But now, adolescents can do something that is called formal operations. And these are the main characteristics of formal operational thought. First is abstract, is idealistic, and as I just told you, is logical. So adolescents can think logically and solving problems in a systematic way, testing solutions like if they were small scientists. This is something that we can do from adolescence, to test hypotheses and to make deductions and to solve problems in a very systematic way. But adolescents are also idealistic. They can think about ideal characteristics. They can generate a full range of possibilities and generate ideals. And they can generate these ideals because now they can think in an abstract way. For them to think, they don't need to be connected with the senses and with the information that they have in front of their mind. They can now solve abstract equations and making operations that are not related to the concrete world. So to think in an abstract way, to be able to generate ideals about themselves and about the world, and to think in a logical way are the three characteristics of the formal. As you can see here, now adolescents can think and make operations about ideas, while before the operations were only based on things that exist in reality. And this ability of dealing with hypotheses, with hypothetical situations, is exactly what allowed you to answer the question of details, to create hypotheses, to think in hypothetical scenarios that indeed doesn't exist in reality, but you can imagine, you can create ideals about it. We have here on this link of YouTube one video illustrating some answers of one adolescent based on this idea. So, adolescence brings a very important shift or change in the way we think. Before, we were only doing an inductive reasoning, moving from the specific observations, from what you have from our experience, to generate hypotheses. Now, adolescents are willing to do the opposite, to do deductive reasoning. They can generate hypotheses in an abstract way and then go to the world to test these hypotheses. It's completely different. We can now create new realities and new hypotheses. Is a completely different way of thinking about the world. In order to illustrate this, I would like you to think a little bit about the Piaget's pendulum problem. Please go to the Google Classroom and try to think about this exercise. What makes a pendulum swing faster or slower? Answer this and then see the way these different kids answer to the same and reflect about uh, how your answers will be different from the answers of these adolescents to try to understand what is deductive or inductive reasoning. But there are also, related to this, there are other forms of reasoning who are having an important improvement in adolescence. First, mathematical reasoning. Because now adolescents can think in an abstract way and logical way, uh, indeed there are much higher level mathematical content that adolescents are now available to manage. And besides that, spatial reasoning. Spatial reasoning means is exactly related to what I told about the maturation of the brain and the differences making the brain more lateralized. So now adolescents are more willing to manipulate spatial information, and that's why it's now that complicated information, for instance, related to geometry, can be introduced in the curriculum of the schools. And finally, scientific reasoning, because they know how to think logically and they are able to make deductions, to define hypotheses and to test them in reality. This is also a new type of reasoning that adolescents now are willing to do. Last type of cognition is the metacognitive orientations. And metacognition is indeed something really important achievement in adolescence. This is related to the ability of thinking about our own thoughts. When I'm starting to think, well, why did I say that? Why I'm thinking like this? Why today I'm why I have this idea? How the hell I decided to do this? So what happens is that in adolescence, uh, our own thoughts start to be object of observation and thinking. And this is indeed a huge achievement. Of course, that as you'll see later in your training, when we overuse metacognition, when we overthink, and when we think too much about our own thoughts, we can become trapped on it. And this might be related to some mental health problems, for instance, related to anxiety, always thinking about myself and why I'm doing this. However, it's also with this ability that we can solve these problems, and this ability indeed can help us to improve a lot as human beings, and we can do that in adolescence. But adolescence also implies a huge development in other cognitive aspects. One of these aspects is what we call temporal perspective of future, exactly because of the ability of thinking in abstract way and the ability to create ideals, adolescents now can think about the future, but imagining themselves different of what they are now. It's really interesting because when we were children, we could think about the future. We could say, oh, when in 20 years I want to be a doctor. But when they were thinking about themselves, kids continue to see themselves as kids. Now, adolescents can anticipate the future and they can see themselves in the future in different ways. This kind of projecting myself in the future is really important in adolescence, and it's why this is a very appropriate moment to do career counseling, for instance, because it's the moment they start to generate possibilities about what I would be and what about I can be. Indeed, this possibility of generating possibilities for the future and for their behavior is really, really important, and it appears in adolescence. You see, adolescence is a moment in which we are a result of what happened with us in the past, but now we have this ability of projecting ourselves in the future. And this is really a huge responsibility that might create some difficulties and challenges. Another important aspect in adolescence is judgment and decision making. In order to make decisions, we need to follow these 4 steps. First, to set a goal, to decide what we want. Then, to generate different options, different possibilities for action. Then, to evaluate the consequences of these different possibilities. If I would decide to do this, this will happen. If I will decide that will happen, in order that I can choose the most appropriate. And then to act and to experience and evaluate the consequences of this decision. So I used to say that the ability to decide and to make my own decisions is the most important experience of spirituality. The moment I make my decisions, I am really free. And to make decisions, our own decisions, usually we need to follow these steps. And decision-making process is something that starts to be much more important in adolescence. And the evidence are showing that older adolescents and adults are better than younger adolescents or children to understand the difference between the different options that we have, to anticipate the consequences of actions, and to learn from the failures and from the successes, to make this evaluation about from my decisions. Indeed, this is a growing process during adolescence. In the beginning of adolescence, kids are more impulsive. They don't anticipate that much the consequences of what they will do, and they might not learn from their failures, and they might continue to repeat their mistakes. And as I told you, with the development of the prefrontal cortex, during adolescence, we will become more willing and able to do this exercise and to be more effective in our decision-making process. But in adolescence, we have also changed in other more traditional and basic cognitive dimensions. For instance, in memory. I think that you know the difference between short-term and long-term memory, and also between implicit memory and explicit memory. What happens during adolescence, indeed, is that the memory is becoming more efficient because adolescents can start to use more elaborated strategies to store, to encode, to store information and to retrieve. When we talk about strategies to memorize, we call it mnemonics. And adolescents now, they have better skills to do that. This is one example of one mnemonics in which we use familiar track that we do in our life to associate it with things that we want to memorize. So in adolescence, that there is a huge expansion of the available working memory or short-term memory. That means that they are now they have the skill to manipulate much more concepts and information at the same time. I think that you remember that the typical measure of short-term memory in adults is 7 units of information. But because of the process of myelination, the processing of the speed of processing also increases, and even though the long-term memory is more or less stable, in adolescence it's more efficient, the process of retrieving information. And indeed, as I told you already, in school age kids use more repetition to support memory. In adolescence, there is a more spontaneous use of elaboration and mnemonics to help to memorize things. In terms of perception, and I think that you know the difference between sensation, that is to sense the information that arrives to our stimulus, and the perception is the way our brain interprets and processes. And the studies are showing that in adolescence, perception becomes more flexible and faster. When I ask you to look at this picture and tell me what you will see, you need to do one decision. That is what we call the segregation figure background. You need to decide what is the figure and what is the background. If you decide that the background is the black, you will see a cup as a figure. If you decide that the background is the white, you can see two faces. And indeed, after 11 years old, we start to do this in a very fast and efficient way that we were not used to do this before in childhood. And indeed, to look at the things and to perceive things as a whole is also a huge achievement in adolescence. So to look at these pictures and to see here a face or to see here a person is something that you can do now easily after adolescence. In childhood, a child would say initially just two butterflies, one instrument, and one hammer, not to see the things as a whole. This ability is achieved and become efficient in adolescence. Another process that is increasing a lot in adolescence is selective attention. We talked about this last year, the ability to select the information that is really important and to focus and to pay attention only to what is really important is something. And do you remember last year I told you of this exercise of central versus incidental learning task to evaluate selective attention. This exercise in which I asked you to look at the transportation, but then at the end I asked you about the animals. So indeed, adolescence is a moment in which we are expected to be efficient and to have a good selective attention. The is much higher and indeed a typical teenager will remember much better the transportation because it's what we ask them to focus. However, in adolescence, even though the skills, the ability for a higher selective attention exists, it also happens that adolescents might be more affected by what we call internal stimulus. Indeed, we adolescents are not that affected by what is happening outside to focus their attention. When we are children, is the noise, is the other colleagues playing or having fun that might distract us. In adolescence, as we can see here, this girl, uh, we can be distracted by what is happening in our mind more often. So this idea of thinking in an abstract way, of thinking about ideals, might make us suddenly to lose our attention from what is happening outside and to be more focused to what is happening inside our brain. Finally, let me just make a brief review about the factors that moderate the expression of cognitive skills in adolescence. We will not spend too much time on this, but I just want you to have a short idea of these four main factors. Why? Because indeed people might have good or not that good cognitive skills. Uh, However, there are people whose cognitive skills are not that good, but they can have good performances. And on the other hand, we might have people with um, good cognitive skills and whose performance is not that good. Indeed, to have skills is not enough. We need to express these skills. And in adolescence, studies are showing that there are these four factors affecting the expression of our cognitive skills. One is the content of the task. Second, the motivation incentive of the task. Third, the demands of the task. And finally, and very important, the role of emotions. So, the content of any given task. The studies are showing that when we make a good selection of the information and that we try to connect the information with something that is familiar with adolescents, and when we present that information in a structured and organized way, the performance of adolescents can increase. So, to organize information and to try to find that information associated to something that is familiar is something that might help the adolescents to perform better. The processing demands of the task is another factor affecting the expression of cognition in adolescence. Indeed, tasks who have more dimensions that have to be coordinated with more instructions and with more steps to be done, they're more complicated to be done exactly because of this difficulty of planification. That's why it's important to organize, as I told, but it's also important to give support and training and heads to the adolescents so they can follow the steps one by one in order to process the information when we have many things that need to be coordinated. The role of emotions in performance. This is the difference between IQ, intellectual quotient, or emotional quotient. Indeed, emotions are very important not only in the decision-making process, but only in the way we focus in the learning activities and the way we perform different tasks. And indeed, people, adolescents who have better self-regulatory skills, for instance, to calm down when I'm anxious, uh, to relax, or to not be too excited when I'm happy. Adolescents who have these good self-regulatory skills, they can perform better cognitive. Based on this, I would like you to do the last exercise, to think a little bit about how to make adolescents or adults to perform better and to be highly motivated. Or put yourself in my shoes. Imagine that you want what you would suggest me to do in order to make you being more motivated and in order to make you express better your cognitive skills. This is really important thing because now you are on that side and maybe someday you will be on this side. So think what you think that can be done to make students being more motivated and to make them having better conditions to express their real cognitive skills. Give me some ideas. And with this, I finish my class and we'll talk about this next Monday. Thank you for your attention. And again, I'm sorry for just sending the video now.